Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's virtual connection, conflict resolution and communication skills, a partnership between the Alumni Association and the School of Leadership and Education Sciences. We are happy you are here. My name is Kara Marsh-Prophet, and I am the Director of Alumni Operations and Engagement at the University of San Diego. When we were sent home to work remotely in March of 2020, the Alumni Association staff pivoted to virtual engagement. And while Zoom is no true substitute for being together in person, it has enabled USD to connect with Toreros far and wide. Since then, we, along with our partners, have hosted nearly 350 virtual events for our alumni and friends. The mission of the Alumni Association is to engage and enrich the Torero community for life. Today's connection is rooted in the desire to offer meaningful ways for our community to stay in touch and to provide you resources to better your lives. We are utilizing Zoom webinar this afternoon and have activated the Q&A functionality for you to ask questions throughout the program. I invite you to do so. Lastly, I would like to thank those of you who support USD philanthropically. If you haven't yet made your annual gift to support our alma mater, please do so before our fiscal year ends on June 30th. Without further ado, I would like to introduce my colleague, Amanda Gonzalez, who will be introducing today's featured speaker. Amanda.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As Kara mentioned, my name is Amanda Gonzalez. I'm the Assistant Director for Alumni Relations at the School of Leadership and Education Sciences, or SOLS. And I am here to introduce you to our presenter, Angelica Tesoriero. Angelica is an Associate Counselor with First Alarm Wellness, which is a USD alumni-owned business that provides concierge behavioral health services for first responders and essential workers. She comes to us from New York and is currently earning her hours for licensure in the state of California. Although she is not a USD graduate herself, Angelica did have the opportunity to take a counseling class through SOLS, her first summer living here in California. Angelica specializes in working with first responder community and has experience helping people with substance abuse issues, stress and anger management, anxiety, trauma exposure, and PTSD. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Angelica.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Amanda. Yes, I am so excited to be here with USD. As Amanda mentioned, though I didn't do my master's program through the University of San Diego, while I was living here, I did get to do one class. And though my time at USD was short, it was absolutely lovely. So any opportunity to get involved, I'm always happy to do so. So thank you very much for having me today. I'm excited to be here. And I'm excited to talk about a topic very, very relevant right now, this conflict resolution stuff. So I will be going into why conflicts arise, especially during times of stress, which I don't think this is news to anybody listening. The past year has been quite stressful. I'll talk about how to mitigate against the impacts that stress can have on our relationships. And then we're going to be talking about specific tools that when you do have a disagreement or a conflict with somebody, specific things you can do to keep it productive. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and share my screen so that we can get started. All right, so the name of this course is Conflict is Inevitable, but Combat is Optional, Diffusing the Natural Consequences of Stress and Fatigue. So, as I just mentioned, it is a stressful time, right? Everyone is stressed right now. The past year has been stressful for a multitude of different reasons, right? The big one being the pandemic that basically turned life upside down, cut us off social connections. We had to change the way that we work, the way that we learn, and the way that we interact with other people. So that was very stressful, and that impacted pretty much all facets of our lives. But then on top of that, life goes on, right? We still have the normal things that make life stressful. Our relationships with other people, how our kids are doing at school, our responsibilities at work and interacting with our coworkers and our friends, just with this added now having to navigate all of that throughout a pandemic. So stress can come from many different areas of life, right? As I mentioned, We have our home stress, especially unfortunately with the pandemic, we experience lots of losses, whether that's, lost time with people or people passing away. Those are always, hard and stressful. Changes to our routine, how much sleep we're getting. I mean, there are just so many things that can impact our stress level. And I don't bring all of this up so that we can just throw a pity party for ourselves and say, well, we're too stressed and I don't know what to do about it. That's not the reason I bring this up. The reason I want to bring this to your attention and to encourage you to think about all the different sources of stress you have going on in your life is so that you can acknowledge it and do something about it. Because whether we want to acknowledge our stress or not, it is still impacting us. And so I find it's helpful for me to avoid making my life harder than it has to be if I can look at my stress head on and then decide how I want to cope with it and how I want to manage it. Additionally, these stressors do not occur in a vacuum. So wouldn't it be nice if we could just all pick one thing at a time and deal with it, just, focus on one thing at a time? Unfortunately, that's not how life happens, right? We might have a lot going on at work that's stressful, and we got in a fight with our partner at home, and our routine or our vacation that we were looking forward to all year got canceled. Luckily now things seem to be on the upswing with everything opening up again, right? But we're still realizing those consequences of the pandemic, and it's still stressful. So we know that stress is coming from a couple different angles too. So it doesn't just occur in a vacuum. So if you have something going on in your workplace that people are stressed about, we want to remember that we don't know what goes on behind closed doors, right? So it's important to lead with that kindness and empathy when we can. So I bring up this term flooding. And it's going to be useful when we're talking about stress in regards to conflict resolution. So flooding is the body's alarm system to help you escape from a perceived threat. When your body perceives a threat, it goes into fight, flight, or freeze mode. So we'll get that surge of adrenaline to help you prepare for a fight or get away quickly. So when I think of fight or flight, and I say the word threat, I don't know why, but what comes to mind is like I'm walking in the jungle or something and a lion pops out. But I live in Southern California, so I'm not in the jungle too often. And to my knowledge, there are not that many lions here. So maybe that's not the most pertinent example, but threats can come in other forms too that are less salient. Sometimes it's in regards to our physical safety, but it's also in regards to our relationships with other people. If we get into a disagreement or a fight with somebody that we care about, our fight or flight might get kicked on from that because that's a threat to either the relationship that we care about, or if somebody who we respect is saying something negative about us, right? That's a threat to our own reputation or our ego. So threats can come in many different shapes and forms. Again, it's all about recognizing what is stressing you out. Even if it doesn't seem like a big deal, you're not doing yourself very much of a service by just trying to ignore it if it's bothering you. So in addition to that adrenaline dump, our heart rate might increase, our breathing quickens, digestion will slow down, the blood pressure rises, and this is all our body's response to help us get to safety. So our body is trying to protect us. That other option there, freeze, that happens if the threat is persistent, if someone lives in a violent area or they're constantly under attack. Sometimes what our brain will do to protect us is dissociate, or we kind of just numb out and don't really feel anything. So this is all to say that stress is not just a feeling that we feel, right? It's not just an emotion, but it has these real life physical consequences as well if we're not managing it. And those can be harmful over time. So when we are stressed for a long time and we're not effectively managing that stress, we can become flooded. Flooding is damaging to the body over time. Essentially, what happens is we have all this buildup of stress and adrenaline and no release. So you might feel anxious. You might have trouble focusing to listen or speak clearly. You might notice that you're having trouble remembering things. You might have trouble sleeping, all these different impacts of that prolonged stress. When we get flooded during a conflict, it can derail what the problem is and create more problems. We could say something that we don't mean in the heat of the moment. We let emotions take over, and that's not always super productive. We're human beings, right? And I'm a therapist for a living, so I'll be the first to tell you that emotions are not a bad thing, but it's kind of hard for them to exist in the same space as logic sometimes when we get really, really intense emotions. Then it can be hard for us to navigate and really weigh our consequences and our options. So when we are flooded during a conflict, we might just, I don't know if you can relate to this. I certainly can. We get caught up in the heat of the moment, and yeah, we might yell, or we might say something hurtful, and looking back, we're thinking, oh geez, I wish I didn't handle it that way. Or our conversation was about a specific topic or issue, but because one or both parties got very intensely emotional, you ended up in a totally different spot. And now you're just arguing about something completely different, or you're arguing about those hurt feelings that you now have because those emotions got so intense and we didn't really check ourselves. So if there are any counselors out there watching this, you guys probably recognize the Gottman name. For those of you who are unfamiliar, Dr. Gottman is like the guy when it comes to couples counseling. He's famous in the field, him and his wife, Julie Gottman. So they do a lot with couples and relationships. But his advice is not just applicable to romantic relationships, it's applicable to all of the different relationships in our life: coworkers, friends, family, romantic partners, all the things. So according to Dr. Gottman, he says that when you're in conflict with somebody and you become flooded with fear or anger, all your best intentions can go out the window, right? How many times has that happened where you're thinking, I feel like I had a really good point. I feel like going into this, I was being very reasonable, and maybe they got defensive, or maybe I got too upset. It's because we care, right? But all our best intentions can go out the window. It's really, really hard to stay productive when we get flooded. So I'll call back to the title of this presentation. Conflict is inevitable. It's going to happen, right? We're going to disagree with people. Tension and conflict are a natural part of existence, happening within ourselves, between people, and the larger world. Oftentimes, people will see that word conflict and they back away slowly because they assume it has to be this long, dramatic, drawn out, emotional thing, and it doesn't have to be that. And that's really the point of the presentation today, that there are ways to disagree calmly, neutrally, productively, right? One of the cornerstones of human progress is having different ideas and listening to different viewpoints, right? If everybody is thinking the same thing, we're not really going to make too much progress. So conflict is going to happen, right? We just have to accept that. We go so out of our way to avoid it sometimes, but it doesn't have to be this dramatic thing to be avoided. There are some things we want to keep in mind to keep our conflict productive. We want to keep in mind that communication is a sender and receiver responsibility. So when we're trying to communicate an idea with somebody, especially if it's an important idea or one that we know has the potential to be kind of sensitive, we must consider our own physiology as well as the other person. So here's what I mean. Shortly before we began this Zoom meeting, we were chatting and saying how, oh yes, I'm on my third cup of coffee for the day and I'm jittery and I'm a little bit on edge, right? Even though I know better than to not drink so much caffeine. Helps us stay awake. So my physiology is, maybe I'm a little bit more on edge right now, or I'm presenting and I want to do well, and that might make me a little bit anxious. So I might be a little bit closer on the fight or flight on some level. Maybe I want to communicate with somebody who, unbeknownst to me, they didn't get a good night's sleep last night, and they are kind of cranky and irritable and not really open to what I have to say. So we want to get good at checking in with ourselves. And as for other people, we can use context clues and we can read their body language, but we're not mind readers, right? We also have that option of asking them, hey, I want to talk about something important to me right now. Are you available for that discussion? Or is there a better time later? Because we're not mind readers, right? But what we do have control over is checking in with ourselves. So before you head into one of these important conflict-prone conversations, check in. Is my heart rate increased? Am I stressed about something else? Am I holding that tension in somewhere? Did I not get enough sleep last night, or did I not eat breakfast and now I'm a little bit cranky? We want to keep those things in mind and adjust our behavior accordingly. So, second half of the title, combat is optional. We can disagree in calm, neutral, or even positive ways. And just because we have differing perspectives on some things, even really important big topics, that does not mean that we're against each other. This idea, this viewpoint, is not always so easy to embrace but it is worth it. Because if we can remember, we don't have to always disagree with people 100% in order to get along with them, life will be so much easier. And as we already established, life can be tricky and stressful enough as it is. So my whole objective with this presentation is really looking at how can we avoid making life harder than it needs to be. So conflict resolution is one of those ways. So before we start getting into the solution part, we have to look at where is the breakdown happening? What are some common themes that get in the way of healthy discussion? These are going to be different for different people. Maybe you notice yourself in some of these and you're a specialist. Maybe you can relate to all of them. I certainly can, so don't feel bad if you can too. But this is going to be different for the individual. So this is where your work comes in really getting to know yourself, or now that you have this knowledge, starting to pay attention in the future of some of these thinking errors that you might fall into. These are very, very common, and these thinking errors are not necessarily a bad thing, because we all have our own biases. We're all human, right? We're not computers or robots. We're not 100% rational all of the time. These thinking errors are not always problematic. However, we want to be checking in with them every so often, because if they get too extreme, or if they're no longer rooted in reality, they're going to be making our life more stressful. So let me go through and explain what they are and give some examples. So the first thing that gets in the way of healthy discussion is thinking in extremes. In other words, black or white thinking, all or nothing thinking. Some examples of this thinking style are you're either with me or you're against me, right? You either agree with me 100% or you don't, and now you're against me. Or if you don't agree with me, then you don't value who I am as a person. This isn't always happening on a conscious level, but if we notice that we're becoming really, really upset when somebody disagrees with us, yeah, it could be as simple as we're upset that somebody disagrees with us, but then I want to know why, right? Are we equating this to something that it's just not equal to? Isn't it possible to respect somebody while not agreeing with everything they say? The answer is yes, but it doesn't always feel that way, and it's easier said than done. So whenever we're thinking in extremes, whenever we use words like always, never, or those judgment words like something is all good or something is all bad, that's an example and a hint that we're probably thinking in extremes. And it's really easy to get caught up in that dichotomy and have your discussion spiral into something that is no longer productive. The next thinking error that gets in the way of healthy discussion is emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning is when we take our feelings and use them as objective evidence for what must be happening. So the example I have here is, I feel angry, therefore this person must be trying to provoke me. So, let's say I'm in Starbucks and somebody cuts the line in front of me. If I'm using emotional reasoning, I'm very angry, right? So they must not care about my time, and they must not care about me as a person. And who do they think they are? And now I'm all spun up and angry. Whereas, isn't it possible that maybe they just didn't see me, or they didn't pay attention, or they didn't get enough sleep last night and they're not really aware of the situation? The thing about emotions is that they are subject to change, and you and the person next to you can have the same exact experience and walk away with different emotions. So while your emotions are valid, and I encourage you to work through that process, they're not proof of reality, right? Because they're so subjective. So we want to avoid emotional reasoning too. The next thing that gets in the way of healthy discussion is mind reading. This happens especially in close relationships with people who we feel like they know us well, and so they should know what we're thinking or what we need. So my example here is, if they really cared about me, they would know what I'm thinking. Not the case, right? Yeah, the people who know us well can probably make assumptions sometimes and be correct, but the most effective way in working through these conflicts is to just put it all out there. Exactly what we need, exactly what we're thinking, how we would like to be supported, how we would like this to come to a conclusion, right? It doesn't mean we're going to get everything we want, but it at least eliminates the guesswork, because guesswork can be really subject to our emotional state, the person's emotional state. So the assumptions we make may change. So ideally, we would like to avoid that with clear communication, but mind reading happens sometimes. And then finally, we have the natural negativity bias. So the natural negativity bias is something that all people have, and it's meant to keep us safe. It's basically, we are always looking for the worst case scenario. We're always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Um, like I said, this is in place to protect us, because if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, back in the day when people did actually have to deal with, wilderness and wild animals trying to hunt them, if I'm walking in the woods and I see something move out of the corner of my eye, I'm probably going to stop walking or jump back or something. Because what if it's a snake, right? So that assumption that I make automatically is like, whoa, pause, check it out, because what if it's a threat? Then maybe I actually look and I assess the situation and I can see, oh, it's just a stick in the ground, no big deal. Um, so if I'm wrong, there's really no consequence there. Maybe I look a little silly for, stopping in my tracks because I saw a twig, but really not a big deal. If I'm right, though, and there is actually a threat to my safety, then I can go ahead and escape that threat or avoid that threat in some way. Again, all with the goal of maintaining our safety. Here's how that plays out in our relationships with other people. Sometimes, and this is different person to person, but maybe somebody with a more anxious attachment style, they're always concerned about, oh, did I do something to upset them? Or their significant other texts them back with just an okay. And oh my goodness, does this mean they're mad at me and this and that? It's probably not because the person loves to be dramatic, although I guess we all know those people, right? Some people live for the drama, but it's really, the goal there is to protect the relationship. We feel if we can predict what will go wrong, we can prevent it, or we can at least understand it and try to fix it in some way. So this natural negativity bias is very, very natural to us. So that example there, this is definitely going to end up in an argument. We want to remember the connection that our thoughts have on our mood and our behavior. So if I'm telling myself, yeah, this conversation is going to end up in an argument, it probably will, because now I'm priming myself to get ready to argue, right? And I'm ready to go on the defense. And when both people have their fists up like this, ready to fight, there's not much good communication that's going to happen there. So those are some of the most common things that get in the way of a healthy discussion. So see what you relate to, if any. Another important thing that can cause the breakdown of healthy communication and conflict resolution is anger. Again, I'm a therapist, so I'm going to tell you, you're entitled to all of the emotions. There is no such thing as a bad emotion. However, if you notice that anger is something that comes up for you often, or you feel it really, really intensely, and it causes you to act in ways that you're not really happy with, like you get angry and you often say something you don't mean or do something that you regret, it's worth your time to try and understand what is going on there. So I like to conceptualize anger as an umbrella emotion. And what I mean by that is we basically like to slap the label of anger onto any negative emotion. If we dig a bit deeper to see what's underneath, we might find something else. Some examples of something that might be underneath anger is we might be feeling disrespected by someone. We might feel ashamed or embarrassed over something that happened, and now we're angry about it. We might feel violated, like somebody crossed a boundary with us. We might feel sad, and sadness might be uncomfortable, so we get angry instead because that's more familiar. Confused, betrayed, guilty, you name it. And it's worth figuring out what is underneath your anger. If you notice it's something coming up for you often, sometimes it's just anger. However, if you dig a little deeper and you find something else there, you are now on a better path to a solution. Because my path ahead is different if I'm feeling sad as opposed to somebody crossed a boundary with me, right? If I'm feeling sad, depending on whatever it's over, right? Maybe that's something I have to accept if it's like a loss or grief or something like that. But if I'm angry because someone violated one of my boundaries, well, now I can make that boundary clear to that person, have that conversation with them of, hey, you crossed a boundary with me, whatever that looks like, and then come to a productive solution, right? As opposed to just sitting in my anger and not really knowing why. So if anger is something that you feel very intensely and very often, it's worth your time to try to figure it out and what's going on there for you. Because it's really, really difficult to have a productive conversation or disagreement with someone when you get really angry. And that's not your fault as a human being. It's just one of those intense emotions. Here's an important one. We must remember to separate our ego from our ideas and beliefs. So if this were on that slide with the, common things that get in the way of healthy discussion, this one is called personalization. We take things personally when we don't need to. And so here's how I like to explain that. When you were a little kid, maybe you believed in unicorns or something like that, right? Now you're an adult who likely has a completely different set of values and beliefs. And the point is, our thoughts are fluid and we don't need to base our entire identity on them. This makes it easier to engage in healthy debates because we can see that people are disagreeing with our ideas and not rejecting us personally. This is not an easy thing to do, but we remember ideas can change, right? Especially in the academic community, the more you learn, then yeah, you adjust your viewpoints or your beliefs. It doesn't mean that everybody has to have the same beliefs, right? Everybody's entitled to their own opinion and interpretation, but we want to keep that strength of being open to new information. And because when we get too rigid in our beliefs and we're basing our entire identity off a belief that is subject to change, talk about an identity crisis, right? If we learn some new information or it's not really working for us anymore. So we want to remember that we can set our ideas and beliefs down. Totally, you're right to have them, but if we can depersonalize that a little bit, someone can disagree with us and we don't take it so personally. Therefore, we're less likely to get defensive and heated and flooded and then spiral into an unproductive disagreement. So I always like to pose this question, and I know this isn't really, we're not at the question and answer part just yet, but it's so easy to get upset over a disagreement with someone that I like to take a step back and think, is there ever really a time where a difference of opinion is dangerous? And maybe we can take that and we can think, well, most of the time, probably not, right? It's probably not life or death. Now, I don't like to make sweeping generalizations. So maybe there are those instances where you genuinely feel, if I can't trust this person to think the same way as me, how can I trust them? Whether this is a coworker or a partner or a friend, someone you care about, maybe you're struggling with that, right? If they don't agree with me rather on this, how can I trust them? So right in the workplace, so as we mentioned in the beginning, I typically work with first responders. So when I'm giving this presentation there, that's kind of nice because they have a protocol for pretty much everything. That's their job, right? If this situation happens, then this is what we do in response. And that's not so dissimilar to a lot of other workplaces. Maybe it's not so regimented, but there is, a protocol. So when we're having those struggles with our coworker, right? What do the rules say, or what do the higher ups say, what have you? But yeah, most of the time, if we can recognize like, hey, I'm getting really, really upset over this disagreement, sometimes this doesn't solve all our problems, but sometimes it can help to take that step back and think, okay, is this a world-ending disagreement? Or is there some way that we can come to a conclusion, resolution, or agree to disagree that continues this relationship? And maybe not. But here's the thing about human beings, we naturally gravitate towards extremes. And here's why. The world is a lot easier to understand when we can decide whether things are completely right or completely wrong. It's like that black and white thinking we were talking about before. If I can look around and objectively say, okay, that's right, that's wrong, that's good, that's bad, I'm just cruising through life. That's very, very easy to understand. But in reality, most things fall somewhere in the middle. It's a shade of gray somewhere in the middle. And if we really look at that, it gives us a lot more grace with ourselves and with other people. But it's a bit more complex and a bit more difficult to understand. So we want to believe that control equals safety. That's not always the case. There's a big difference between control and influence. But as human beings, we have a hard time letting go of that. We think if I could just get everyone to agree with me and we can all be on the same page, right, then things will go smoothly and we won't run into any problems. Most of the time, we're overestimating the amount of control we have in a situation on the first place. Like when people ask me, how can I get the person that I'm disagreeing with to agree with me or to react in a certain way? I wish I had an answer for you, but you can't. We can't control how other people react. Don't get me wrong, there is a point to this presentation. There are plenty things that we can do that up our chances of being understood, of having a productive conversation, but there's really never a scenario where we can control how another person is reacting to us. So we want to practice our acceptance there a bit. So some common misconceptions. If we follow the rules, things will work out and people will respect you for it. Wouldn't that be nice, right? If we were always doing what we are supposed to do and the world was just fine. The thing is, you and I might have a different definition of what the right thing to do is, right? People might not always agree with your decisions, whether in the workplace or at home. That's just something we have to accept. Another common misconception: if I give up the right to be in power or have control, I will be unsafe. So if I'm not controlling these conversations with my loved ones or my coworkers or my friends, then something might go wrong. Their relationship might be in jeopardy. It's not always happening on such a conscious level, but that's really the driving force there. We want to maintain our safety. We want to make sure things are okay and everyone's in accordance because of the fact that we're social creatures as human beings, right? We feel our best when we are connected and thriving within our social systems, whether those systems are at work with our coworkers, at school with our classmates, with our friends, with our group of buddies that we go out surfing with. We want to feel connected and accepted. So these common misconceptions can be really hard to let go of. But we want to remember that more balanced take, ground ourselves in reality. That in reality, we're all doing the best we can with the information that we have within our belief system and through our own perspectives. In short, you do the best you can with what you have. At the end of the day, we're making decisions that we believe to be in the best interest of ourselves and those people that are important to us. Generally, people want to do well. Generally, we want to thrive, right? So even from the outside, if we're looking at someone thinking, how could they be making those decisions? Like, in what world does that make sense? It's very rare for someone to consciously make things worse for themselves. Maybe they know it on some level of, oh, I really shouldn't be doing this, or yeah, we keep getting in these fights. But on some level, there's some sort of motivation there where maybe they're not going about it in the best way, but they are trying to reach some sort of goal. Debate is healthy. We don't grow without some confrontation of our knowledge, right? I mean, that's talk about like science in general, right? If we just accepted things as they were 500 years ago, I don't know, maybe we wouldn't have light bulbs and all the things. I don't know when they invented light bulbs, but you understand what I mean, right? A difference of opinions and ideas is actually really, really valuable. So we don't want to stomp that out completely. We don't want to always avoid conflict because it can be really, really productive at times. We just got to keep it that way and avoid it becoming too emotional or heated. And it's a lot easier to relate to somebody, even if it's someone you disagree with often. If it's a coworker, for example, and you have to interact with them, right? There's no way around it. It's a lot easier to interact with that person if you remind yourself, they're just another person doing the best they can with what they have. They don't agree with me, fine, right? But they're doing the best they can with what they have. It just makes it easier to connect with our empathy skills. So here is one of the first little tools that I like to give out when we're talking about conflict resolution. I know it's a lot of circles. I had this idea in my mind, and this is my attempt at putting it on paper, so to speak. So let me explain what all these circles mean. So my first piece of advice for you all is to check your alignment. When you're in a disagreement or a conflict with somebody, check where your alignment lies. So let's say, for example, it's you and your significant other, and you're in this fight. You want to make sure you're thinking about it as me and my partner versus whatever the problem is. Maybe your problem is your lack of communication between one another, or not being on the same page about values or boundaries or something like that. But you want to keep it as you two on the same side, and you're going to overcome whatever your issue is that is preventing you from your goal of a happy relationship. Not me versus my partner, because when it becomes one person versus the other, we're priming ourselves for a fight. And is there ever really a satisfying conclusion in those scenarios where I'm right and you're wrong and haha, and now we're just supposed to continue on, right? That doesn't feel good in a relationship. At work or at school, you can look at things as my coworkers and I, or my classmates and I, versus whatever prevents us from reaching our goals. My mind goes right back to my grad school and college days where group projects were a thing, and I never really liked them because I have trouble following my own advice of letting go of control, right? So I want to do my things my way, and my group members want to do things their way, and that can cause conflict and tension. But if I remind myself, okay, we all have the same goal, I hope, of getting an A in this class, right? We all want to do well. It makes it a lot easier to navigate those disagreements than if I'm looking at it as me and me versus my classmates and they're out to get me or something like that. Because one, it's not accurate more often than not. And two, it's just not going to help you work through these conflicts productively. So that's what I mean by checking your alignment. And once again, debate is healthy. We do not grow without some confrontation of our knowledge. So it doesn't always have to be a threat or a bad thing. So I'm about to take you guys through the conflict resolution model. And maybe it's because I've given this presentation a few times, but admittedly, it can be a little clinical, a little dry. So before I get into the nitty gritty, let me explain to you why something like this is worth your time. So human beings do our best when we feel connected with others, right? As I mentioned, social creatures. If we're unable to disagree and debate ideas respectfully, we will end up alienated from our team. Whether that team is our classmates, our coworkers, our families, our significant others, whatever that team looks like, if we can't disagree respectfully, we're going to end up alienated, and that's not a good feeling. Because being a member of a team requires trust. So this is all in an effort to maintain that trust, that we don't have to agree about everything. We can still work together. So here it is, the conflict resolution model, step by step. 1, you want to identify the problem. So identify the specific problem that is causing the conflict. The more specific you can be, the better success you will have. Then you want to identify the feelings associated with the conflict and identify the specific impact or outcome of the problem causing the conflict. So what are the consequences, right? Yes, this thing is happening. What does that mean for you? Then, and this is the hardest one, decide whether to resolve the conflict or let it go. If you're someone like me who doesn't love conflict in the first place, you might be eager to say, you know what, it doesn't bother me, no big deal, I can just let it roll off my back. But if you're thinking about it days later, or you notice yourself saying, oh my goodness, it's always the same argument with this person, that is a sign that it's probably worth your time to finish the argument through or finish the disagreement through. So this requires some rigorous honesty with yourself. Some things you can let go, some things not. So if you decide that this is something that you want to address, then you address and resolve the conflict. So set up a time to address the conflict, describe how you perceive it, express your feelings about it, and discuss how it can be resolved. How would you like it to be resolved? And you want to consider whether a compromise is needed. So that's the 5-part model. And here's a short little example. So the example is with 2 friends and they both work at the same job, and one goes to pick up his friend, and his friend that he's giving a ride to is late. So he asks to speak with him about that. And he says, sure, is something wrong? So using the conflict resolution model, Pat goes, I've noticed you've been late for the past few days when I've come to pick you up. Today, I realized that I was starting to feel frustrated and a bit taken for granted. When you're late, we're both late for work, which makes me uncomfortable. I like to be on time. I'm wondering if you can make an effort to be on time in the future. And his friend, because this is an example that I made up, reacts very positively to it. I am aware of the fact that nobody talks like this in real life. I know that. I know it's a cheesy example, but let me explain why it works. So if we're looking at Pat's bubble there, when he says, I noticed you've been late, take what will work for you, figure out how you might put this in your own words. But he's speaking from his perspective. He says, I was starting to feel frustrated. I'm starting to feel taken for granted. Not, you're a bad person. You don't respect me or my time, and you're a problem. Because that's going to engage the other person's defensive. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but it's not productive. So you want to keep it from your perspective. He lays out the problem very clearly. It's that his friend is late, and he offers a solution right then and there. I'm wondering if you can make an effort to be on time. Now, beyond that, he was very, very clear about what the problem is and how he'd like to see it concluded. So in my example where things are made up, I like to think his friend made good on his word and was on time from then on. But if this is playing out in real life and somebody either disagrees with you of like, how dare you say something to me, or they're still late, then that's on you to draw that boundary of, okay, well then respectfully, you have to find another way to work, or I can't be your ride anymore, or can I continue in this relationship? So this is a very simple example, but those are the elements that you want to take away from it. We also want to remember the tension reduction phase. So the tension reduction phase is when maybe things got a little bit heated during your discussion and you're not very happy with how you ended it, or it didn't really come to a satisfying conclusion. This is where, after we've calmed down and the other person has had a chance to calm down, we extend that olive branch out to invite them back into the conversation. So you might say something like, clearly this topic is really important to the both of us. Do you have time to finish that conversation tomorrow? Or, I'm not very happy with the way I reacted yesterday. Can we grab some coffee and try that again? We are introducing empathy here. We are inviting them back in a calm, peaceful way to conclude the conflict, not to fight again, right? So we keep in mind we got a little emotional the first time, and we do our best to connect with like that calmness or connect with the whole goal of the conversation in the first place. Because again, if you notice yourself saying over and over again, oh my goodness, it's always the same fight, it's probably because you're not having it all the way through. So we know conflict is going to happen. So let's not ignore it or not finish it through so that it continues to happen, right? We'll work through our things so we don't have to deal with them again. And we also want to keep in mind our communication style and act assertively when possible. So on the spectrum of communication, we have passive on one corner, which is that person who wants to avoid conflict, not speak up for themselves, kind of like the doormat, right? You let people walk all over you. This is a good way to avoid conflict, but it's probably going to contribute to some feelings of resentment because you're never standing up for yourself. You're never enforcing your boundaries. On the other side of that, we have aggressive. So that's when people yell or shout over other people or behave aggressively, like slam a door or get into a fight. You probably will get what you want acting that way, but it's going to be at the expense of your relationships. So the goal here is to act assertively. That's when you're demonstrating that your needs and the other person's needs are equally important. You stand up for yourself and let your ideas be known, but you also leave space for compromising and different ideas. So it's kind of like that happy medium of communication. As I mentioned, we want to keep in mind that sender-receiver responsibility. So that importance of timing is not to be underestimated. You might be in the space to have an important conversation, but if another person is in a state of arousal, like they're scared, they're angry, they're rigid, it doesn't matter how good of a point I have or how right I am or how reasonable I'm being, they're just not going to hear what I have to say. So we want to keep in mind that timing is important. The best way to do that is by asking the person, hey, when do you have time for this conversation? And we want to practice that acceptance. This is my disclaimer to you all that though these skills are wonderful and you should use them, it doesn't mean that people are always going to agree with you. This ups our chances that we're going to be heard and understood, but we can't control how other people provoke us. We can control how we get to react to that. And finally, we want to remember our empathy. So empathy is not that we're agreeing with the other person or signing off on their behavior, but we're connecting with their thoughts or their feelings, and we're trying to relate to them and see things from their perspective. It allows people to feel heard and understood and is a really effective tool in de-escalating conflict, right? If you were to just say to someone, wow, you seem frustrated. I would be frustrated too, when someone's not agreeing with me like that, or we're not seeing eye to eye. Clearly, this is really important to us. It kind of just, again, extends that olive branch and allows for some connection. So in closing, as we approach on the question and answer portion of this, my quick tips kind of summarize for you all here. So for good conflict skills, get to know your signs of escalation. By that, I mean, sometimes we feel like stress comes out of nowhere, and we just feel totally overwhelmed and we don't know what to do. And it feels very random. More often than not, it's not though. So get to know your signs of becoming stressed out before you're at the full stress. Maybe your heart rate increases. Maybe you carry tension in your shoulders. If you're able to identify that stress before it escalates, then you can do something effectively to cope with it or to avoid getting to that feeling of being totally overwhelmed. So start paying attention to what happens to you when you are on your way to being stressed out. And if you don't know where to start, I promise, ask anyone who knows you and they'll be able to tell you, oh yeah, I can tell you're stressed because you have that vein that pops out of your forehead or something like that. Know when and how to take a break from a conversation. It's okay to do a timeout. Think about how that might look for you beforehand, right? You might say whatever you're comfortable with of, okay, I'm getting a little spun up right now. We're going to have to come back to this and then come back to it. Be clear about your boundaries and get comfortable enforcing them respectfully. Communicate your emotions with people you trust. This has been a lifesaver for me during the pandemic. Some days I would just wake up and the world's in a pandemic and I was feeling stressed out and I would feel grumpy. So I would let my, the people in my house know, hey, you guys didn't do anything wrong. I'm just having a grumpy day today. Like, please don't take it personally. And people can then meet you where you're at, give you some grace, give you some empathy, and not create further conflicts from you being grumpy with your people when they didn't do anything wrong. So that's very helpful. Remember, it's okay to not have all the answers and to change your mind when presented with new information. That's the sign of someone who takes in new information and is open-minded, and that's a good thing. So it's okay to change your mind. We also want to keep in mind our support system. So you don't always have to know how to do everything yourself. We remember our families, our friends, of course, counselors, but whoever that community is for you, it's always helpful to bounce your ideas off of somebody objective. And so that concludes the information portion of my presentation. I thank you all for your attention and everything. I think Amanda had mentioned that there were some questions sent in beforehand, so we can go ahead and answer those. And Amanda, let me know if I should keep my screen shared or bring it back.
If you want to stop share, that might be easier. There you go. And we do have a couple of questions already. And if you've had something come up during the presentation, please drop them in the Q&A section. So the first question that came in is, I do not like conflict and I shy away from it and don't engage, which causes more issues. How can I stop?
First of all, me too. So it's okay, you're not alone. Here's what I would say to that. When a conflict comes up, connect with why it's bothering you or what is the benefit in solving that conflict. If it's an ongoing thing or if it's about a particular issue, identify, okay, here's what I have to gain if we do work through this. Here is what I have to lose if we don't. And kind of like a pros and cons type thing. The more specific you can get with your conflict, like defining the conflict, whatever that problem is, the better. Because it can be really overwhelming and kind of scary to just label it as like, oh my goodness, me and this person have this big problem and I don't know what to do. But if we can break it down into more concrete things of like, they were late, or I don't, they don't speak to me respectfully, or we disagree on this topic, that's more manageable for us. So I guess that's my long-winded way of saying, identify why you want to solve it in the first place, connect with that intention. And depending on the relationship, like I'm not quite sure if it's with a coworker or someone you trust, but if it's someone you feel a little comfortable around, you can share that with them of, hey, this isn't really comfortable for me, but this is what's going on. I'm not quite sure how to handle it. What do you think, or what's your feedback? And approach it from a problem-solving perspective, as opposed to like, oh, me versus you, and now we're in a fight. So yeah, that would be my answer to that question.
Thank you. And the second question is, what is the best way to avoid conflict when someone continuously responds with counter arguments instead of conversing?
So I guess that's a really good question. I think that would depend on the nature of the relationship. Again, is this a coworker that you don't like, but you're going to have to deal with them anyway? That's one thing. Is this a friend who maybe it's possible you've outgrown that friendship, right? If it's something that somebody is not willing to budge on or to communicate on, that's a scenario. So you have to decide, okay, what type of relationship is this? Is this one that's going to continue or not? And then maybe inviting in some empathy of like, hey, you seem like you really care about this, or this seems really important to you. And I notice you getting kind of defensive, what's going on? Because again, depending on the nature of that relationship, you can effectively align yourself with that person, or say something empathetic like, yeah, I would be upset too if someone didn't agree with me on this, or I know what it's like when I feel like I have such a good point and I'm just not seeing eye to eye on a person. And then maybe sharing with them, here's why I would like to get this resolved. Maybe it's one of those things that you have to agree to disagree on, and not everybody's personality is amenable to that. Some people feel like they really need you to agree with them. So it depends on how in the weeds you want to get with them, right? Of exploring that of like, hey, why is this so important to you that I agree with you on this? Because I still love and respect you, even if we don't see the same way or not. But kind of just seeing what's going on there. And if it's one of those relationships like, okay, they're going to be in my life and they tend to be combative, set your boundaries. You have that right to say, hey, I'm not talking about this right now. Or I'm not available for this discussion right now. So, you know, we don't always want to avoid that conflict, but if we know it's not going anywhere productive, you can set that boundary and say, yeah, I can't have this conversation right now, either another time or we're not having this talk.
So that's all that I see in there. Do any of our other participants have any questions they want to pop in? Guess
I'll
not.
pop in with a with just a not so much a question, but a thank you, Angelica. You know, this wellness series and certainly today's and this topic of conflict resolution, I think is really important considering I think it's important at all times, but considering the last 14 months that we all have been experiencing, it is really important to be able to center ourselves and grow as human beings and set those boundaries and have those conversations. So I really appreciate your time and your energy today, and certainly as well as your expertise. Well, thank you again, Angelica. What a pleasure to hear from you. You are dynamic on screen, that's for sure. So we just really appreciate all of your time.